On your mouth to God's ears. Okay, everybody, good evening, good morning. I've been up since 5 o'clock in the morning, so it feels like it's evening already. Okay, so this is a beautiful class. It's an interesting halachic class that has a lesson also at the end of it. But it's more of a halachic question, a halachic quest about the concept of leaving Egypt and going back to Egypt. As it's mentioned in this week's Parsha, this concept of not going back to Egypt, that the Jews should not go back. We know that God didn't want the Jews to go back to Egypt. From the time that He left, the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, from the time they left from Egypt, God didn't want them to go back to Egypt. That's the first reason why He led them through a different way and didn't lead them the straight way, in a shorter way, because as the Torah says, right when they left Egypt, God was afraid they would go back to Egypt. And the Jewish people, as they journeyed through the desert, they always wanted to go back to Egypt. And therefore we find in this week's Parsha the prohibition about going back to Egypt. That's a prohibition in the Torah to go back to Egypt. So this concept of leaving Egypt is a very important part. We celebrate the holiday of Pesach every year, and for the going out of Egypt. And actually, we mention every single day in the sixth remembrance in the Siddur. We mention we're going out of Egypt. We mention our prayers going out of Egypt. According to Chassidut, we are still going out of Egypt because Egypt is Mitzarim, is a concept of of confinement, and a Jew needs to go out of Egypt. That's what Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, that in the Siddur, in the Haggadah, we say in every generation a Jew has to feel like he's going out of Egypt. And Alter Rebbe says every day a Jew has to feel like he's going out of Egypt. So every day we're supposed to feel like we're going out of Mitzrayim, we're going out of Egypt. So there's some aspect of us going out of Egypt and us wanting to go back to Egypt, whether it's the physical Egypt or the spiritual Egypt. We always want to go back to it. And why do we want to go back to it? Because we maybe never left it. And how do we leave Egypt? How does one leave Egypt? How does ultimately one have the capability of leaving Egypt? We need to. That's really what we need to accomplish. Why can't we leave Egypt for some reason? Why do we keep on going back to Egypt? So that's why this class is called Let's Go and Move Forward. That's the class. That's the name of the class. Let go and move forward. That sometimes we don't want to let go, and therefore we're never moving forward. We are always holding on to the past. We're always holding on to the Egypt of the past, and it doesn't let us move forward. Therefore, there's a mitzvah in the Torah not to go back to Egypt. So, the bulk of the class is going to be a halachic discussion about Egypt. Okay? So it's going to get a little bit halachically interesting, but the lesson is the most important part of the end of the class, because most of us don't have this issue, anybody going to Egypt in the future. What?
Can you go?
That's a question. So there will be a question. Can you go as a tourist? It's a good question. So this is but who's going to Egypt? Anybody's interested in flying to Egypt? I don't know. But whatever. So it's a halachic question whether you're going to Egypt or not going to Egypt. It's in the Torah, this week's portion. So we're going to go through this halachic, a little bit of a halachic concept, and the most important thing is the lesson that we learn from the Torah reading. So we start on page 107, which is the verse in the Torah that we are going to. It's the beginning of the Torah, but actually the verse is a little bit further. The second verse. Okay, so we'll start the Torah. Kisava Le'aretz, page 107, text number 18. When you come to the land of Israel, that your Lord, your God, is giving you, and you possess it, and live therein, and you say, I will set a king upon myself, like all the nations around me. Right? You want a king. So the Torah says, you shall set a king over you, one who the Lord your God chooses from among your brothers. You shall set a king over yourself. You shall not appoint a foreigner over yourself, one who is not your brother. Only he may not acquire many horses for himself. This is the third verse. Why? Why is a king not to acquire many horses? So that he will not bring the people back to Egypt. Right? So he won't bring the people back to Egypt to get an Arabian horse. Right? The Torah doesn't want you to get that you're going to go back to Egypt. He's going to want a special horse. He's going to like these horses. He's going to want a lot of horses and better horses. He's going to go back to Egypt.
Why?
And because he'll want to get those horses. Yeah. So he'll go back to Egypt, the people will go back to Egypt, and in order to acquire many horses. For the Lord said, you shall not return that way anymore. Do not go back to Egypt. Okay, so we have an Aveda. The Torah says you're not to go back to Egypt. Simple as that. You're not to go back to Egypt. That's what it says.
For a visit, you go back.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not gonna. We'll get to it in a minute. Let's understand the law first. Law says you can't go back to Egypt. Rashi says he may not acquire many horses for himself, but only what he needs for his chariots, so that he will not cause the people to return to Egypt to purchase horses, because horses come from there, as it said of Solomon. And a chariot that went up and left Egypt sold for 600 shekel of silver, and a horse 150. So ultimately, King Solomon went back to Egypt. He went to get a horse in Egypt. That's when God tells you don't do something. He went to get a horse. Bought a special horse in Egypt. Horses in Egypt.
Egyptian.
So I heard somebody in the background over there say about Maimonides. So let's see what Maimonides says about it. Let's go to Maimonides.
Solomon was supposed to be so wise, but he did something so foolish.
He married 1,000 wives too. So it's good to be king. We're not going to get into that. That's a whole different subject. But Solomon, because Solomon was a righteous man, so we're not going to go into his philosophical reasons. So the Maimonides, who lived in Egypt, talks about the law. He writes this: the 46th prohibition is that we are forever forbidden from living in the land of Egypt. That's the prohibition. The 46th prohibition in the Torah is you're not allowed to live. The Rambam codified all the 365 negative commandments and 248 positive commandments. He codified all the commandments. He said what each commandment was. So he writes the 46th of the 613 commandments is you're not to go back to Egypt. The purpose of this prohibition is that we should not learn from their hearsay and not come to imitate their behavior, which the Torah is considered wicked. The Torah considered that the life of the Egyptians was a wicked lifestyle. The source of this prohibition is this week's portion. It's God's statement. You must never again return on that path. That's it. So the Rambam says you're not allowed to go back to Egypt. But then he continues in text 2b, page 109. However, there's always a but to every rule. However, one may go there for business or to pass through to another land. You may not return there to live, but you may return there to do business or trade or to conquer another land. So there is
Business is a horse.
right. So you can go get a horse, but right? So really, you could go do business. Yeah, you do business. So the Rambam gives that leeway, right? Up here, halacha, that if you're going there for business. Now the Rambam was not there for business. He lived in Egypt for many years. He died in Egypt. He was buried in Israel, but he lived there and he died in Egypt. He died in Egypt. So we know in history, if you go back to history, I'm not a history maven, but at the time of the first temple, there was a king, the Syrian king. He ultimately conquered Israel. The Assyrians, they made a lot of tzaras in the land of Israel, the Syrians. There was a whole Hanukkah stories with the Syrians. So he was Sancherev. He didn't conquer Israel. Actually, he almost conquered Israel. And the whole story in the prophets, Yecheskel, with the story of the night that God made a miracle and Sancherev was destroyed. But he almost destroyed the whole world until he came to Yerushalayim, until he came to the gates of Jerusalem, and God saved the Jews. Yecheskel. It's a famous story. You can look it up in the prophets. But Sancherev almost conquered the whole world, like all these big warriors, Babylonians and Romans, etc. So the Assyrians almost conquered the whole world. And what he did was, he was afraid, like any other dictator, he was afraid of, what was the biggest fear? Rebellion. That was the biggest fear, especially in those days. That when you conquered a different country, you were very far away from that country. So they were always afraid of rebellions. So how did Sancherev, this king, decide to take care of that issue? So besides killing a lot of people, to show his power, he basically moved everybody around. He did the mass deportation. So he took the Egyptians and took millions of them and moved them into a different country. Moved millions of the other people into Egypt, and that's what he did. He mixed up the whole area. That was his idea of how to control the world. So everybody would be strangers, and the Egyptians would not be in Egypt, and the I don't know what the countries are around there, but all the countries around there, you take all the countries and you mix them all around. And you mix them up, one country in a different country, you're going to have basically everybody feels like strangers. That's what Yosef did in a way. The Torah said, Joseph, how did he do? He wanted the Jewish people to feel comfortable in the land of Egypt. What did he do? He mixed up Egypt. Right? He took Egypt and he moved everybody around. So everybody felt like strangers. Right? They were all foreigners in their own living in their own place. So suddenly you were deported to another part of Egypt, and he took another part of Egypt, moved you to another part of the place.
When he was buying up their land?
Yeah, he was buying up the land, moving them around, and basically, Rashi says that he made everybody feel like the foreigners, and now the Jews were like foreigners, like anybody else. Nobody say, "What are you doing over here? What are you doing here? You don't belong here. You never were here." So everybody was never here. Like Florida. Nobody was ever here. Who's a Floridian? All coming from Brooklyn, from Chicago, from here, from there. Oh, California. Nobody's here. Nobody can say, how many people can say, I'm a Floridian born in Florida? We're not. Most we're not. And those that are born in Florida run away. Whatever. We're all foreigners in this place. We're all foreigners. That's what. So Sancherev did the same thing. Sancherev did the same thing. He came to destroy Eretz Yisrael. Sancherev, the Syrian king Sancherev. He came to destroy Eretz Yisrael, and that's the story of the prophets. As he came to the city of Yerushalayim, he was by the doors of Yerushalayim, and the Yecheskel prayed. He was the king, and God saved them. And at night they thought there was an army. They had a dream that there was, not a dream. They had a feeling that God made the sound of armies coming, and they all ran away from the camp. They left all the stuff there. That's the story of the 4 lepers who were sitting at the gates of Jerusalem, and they came to the camp of the Sancherev, of the Syrians. They found this totally empty, all the food there and everything there, because the whole army ran for their lives. And this is a famous story. So in essence, so the truth is, what is the point of that? The point of that is really Egyptians are not Egyptians. Right? Who says Egyptians are Egyptians?
Egyptian.
Right? They're not Egyptians. Because they came from another country. Sancheiriv mixed the different countries. So maybe Egyptians are not Egyptians. So when God said don't go back to Egypt, is when the Egyptians were there, but now there's no Egyptians there. There's another different people, different nationalities.
Oh, so maybe now you're allowed to travel.
So maybe you're allowed to go there. Maybe you're allowed to live there. Because ultimately you see that not only the Rambam lived there were thousands or hundreds of thousands of Jews who lived in Egypt. In the 1500s, in the 1400s. What are the Jews of Spain that ran from Spain? Most of them went to Egypt.
Really?
Sure.
Yeah, so he said it was okay because it wasn't really.
So look at the Maimonides. Look at the text number 3. When Sancheiriv, king of Assyria, arose, he confused the identities of all nations. Mixing, he almost conquered the world, and he together and exiling them from their place. The Egyptians that lived in the land of Egypt at the present are from other nationalities. Yeah?
I want to ask a question. I don't know if this is correct, but going back to Egypt is a place of negativity, right?
Right. Because of the people, not the land.
No,
it's the people.
The people of Egypt
Right.
are negative.
Right.
So actually, I think what I'm getting from this is not to go back to the negativity. We look at ourselves and not go back to Egypt, which means don't go.
Okay, but you're going to the lesson. We're going to the law right now about going back to Egypt. The Torah prohibition. Let's just do one thing at a time. So the Torah tells you not to go back to Egypt. It's not talking to you about. We'll get to the lesson later. The moral ethical lesson. We'll talk. As I said, first we're going to talk about the law. Okay. So the Rambam writes. Let's look at the Rambam. Let's 1 second. The Rambam writes, because this also applies to other laws in the Torah, this concept, as you'll soon see in a second. Right? So the Rambam writes, the Egyptians that lived in the land of Egypt at the present are other nationalities. This also applies regard to Edomites in the field of Edom. They're not Edomites anymore. He came, and there's you don't know who Edom is, who Moav is, who for example, who are the 7 nations you have to destroy in the Torah. You don't know who's any. You don't know who's who, anybody. Who's Amalek? You don't know who's Amalek. Let's finish this thought. So let's finish the Rambam. In so much as these 4, so example, the Torah prohibits 4 nations. The Torah prohibits a Jew marrying an Edomite, an Egyptian. The Torah prohibits an Egyptian to be married in the Jewish, even an Egyptian convert to be married in the Jewish nation. So what happens if a girl from Egypt converts? You're not allowed to marry her? According to Torah, the simple meaning of the Torah, you're not allowed to. You're not allowed to marry an Egyptian girl, even if she converts. But the Rambam says no. Who says she's in Egypt?
Yeah, she could be from somewhere.
She could be another. She could be somebody else. So therefore, until Sancheiriv, Egypt was Egypt. And Edom was Edom, and each country had its own identity. Sancheiriv came, and he mixed up the whole world in that area, especially that area. Mixed them all up. Whatever he can go again, you can go into Google and find out exactly the Syrian king what he did in his time. So therefore, let me just finish the Rambam. For when any one of them separates himself from them by converting, we operate under presumption. This is a very important thing in halacha. in Jewish law, we operate on the presumption that they became separate from the majority. Therefore, at the present age, in all places, whether they converts, whether they are Edomite, an Egyptian, Ammonite, a Moabite, a Cushite, or from any other nation, whether male or female, she is permitted to marry the Jewish people. You don't say, wait a second, maybe the Torah says you can't marry a Moavi, you can't marry a Moabite. The Torah says you can't marry an Egyptian woman or Egyptian man. The Torah doesn't mean that when they're not Jewish. When they're not Jewish, you're not marry any nation. The Torah says you're not allowed to marry if they would convert. What do you do with a convert of a Moabite? She'll have to marry a convert from a Moabite. She can't marry a Jew. And ultimately, after a couple generations, they'll be able to marry into the Jewish people.
So Ruth converted before she married?
So that was Ruth. So Ruth was the teaching, you're not allowed to marry a Moabite man, but you're allowed to marry a Moabite woman. That was the whole teaching of the Moabite. That the prohibition was marrying a Moabite man and not a Moabite woman. So that was the loophole for Ruth marrying in the Jewish people. Because she was a woman. The Torah says you're not allowed to marry a Moabite man. Even if he would convert. Comes the Rambam and says, yeah, that was good until Sancheiriv. Until this Assyrian king came, that was good. That was the law. But now, there's no Moabites. There's no Egyptians. It's all one big chalad.
Absolutely.
And therefore, there's a general law, right? There's not Egyptians one country. If you have a girl, right? And she, or a boy, whatever, it doesn't make a difference whether you're a boy or a girl. And she converted, or he converted, and he says, I'm an Egyptian. So you say, Egyptians one country, there's 10, 20 other countries around there. So majority, you go to the majority. Probably, he's not an Egyptian.
Okay. That I got.
But that's not so simple. Okay, but we're trying to explain the law. You have to get the law. You have to think about the law. Right? So that's we'll get back to this law in a second. So that's the concept of the Rambam. Maimonides says ultimately Egypt is not the Egypt that was before Sancheiriv. Egypt is not the Egypt after Sancheiriv. It's a different Egypt. And the Egyptian people, majority of the Egyptian people were taken away from the country. And therefore, it's a majority, most Egyptians not really Egyptians. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to ask a question. First of all, I know you're going to answer my question, no, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. Is it possible that Maimonides was wrong about anything ever?
No.
Okay.
So
then the question is, in the Torah specifically says, it points out, it doesn't say anything about the people. It says that Egypt, what about the land? Egypt is a land that's always watered.
Therefore, the Rambam gave a reasoning to Torah's prohibition. And what was the reason that the Rambam gave to the Torah's prohibition? Was that you're going to learn from their ways. They're not Egyptians anymore. They're a different country. They're different people.
Egypt is a land that has this Nile, and they live off that. But Israel is bordered by.
That's a different. It's a different.
But why is the Torah making?
Again, that doesn't make them despicable. Egyptians were despicable people. They were immoral people. At the times of the Torah, in times of the Torah, the Egyptians were immoral people.
But isn't the Torah making a point that Hashem is providing in Israel versus?
Yeah, but that's not this prohibition. That's not this prohibition. That's not a concept. That's not this prohibition.
Where does? Okay, I don't know. Okay.
It's not that you can't mix apples and oranges. So it's not this prohibition. The prohibition over here is that you're not to go back to Egypt because the Rambam writes the reason is because you don't want to. Abish didn't want that the people would learn from the Egyptians. because the Egyptians had a very abominable, I don't know, a very immoral way of living, and therefore the Torah didn't want people to learn from their ways. But ultimately, they're not Egyptians. The problem is the real question that you have to ask is, okay, so you can marry, maybe the Rambam holds you can marry an Egyptian girl, but that doesn't give you the right to live in Egypt. That doesn't answer the question about living in Egypt.
Egyptians, and the reason we're not supposed to go back to Egypt is because to follow the Egyptian ways, but they're no longer Egyptians. Why can't we go there to
Yeah,
live?
exactly.
Yeah, but ultimately, good. But ultimately, if you just take the verse on the face, the Torah says you're not allowed to go back to Egypt. So I understand they're not Egyptians in concerning marriage and concerning these situations. But why would we say that even though, like he just said, why would you say that even though they're not Egyptians, the Torah says don't go back to the land of Egypt? So how does the Rambam get around that concept?
Maybe the land was defiled, the land itself.
Could it have been?
In other words,
So
anything that came off of the land was tumah.
The Rambam writes in his letters, every letter he writes, the Rambam, when he lived in Egypt, he wrote on every letter that he wrote, the Rambam who does 3 sins every day
By living there.
by living in Egypt.
3?
Yeah, because the 3 times in the Torah it says that not to live in Egypt. So he says, the Rambam, he used to end his name, who's doing 3 sins every day.
Why would he do that? Why would he? I mean, he's Rambam.
The money was good.
Because Parsha, it was not a sin.
What?
It was not a sin. But to him, he felt he had no choice. To him, he felt he had no choice but to live in Egypt.
the Torah also says
The Rambam had no choice to live in Egypt. It was not his choice. He was under the caliph, and he had no choice. He could not leave. He couldn't leave. No, he ran there, and he was ultimately stuck there. So he wasn't planning to stay in Egypt, but he was forced to stay in Egypt. But he still felt that it was a place that he didn't belong.
Right.
But it's not only the Rambam that lived in Egypt. There were millions of Jews that lived in Egypt.
Yeah, but not
There were
alone.
millions of Jews that lived in Egypt, not only in times of the Rambam. There were millions of Jews that lived in Egypt in the times of the first Beis HaMikdash. Millions of Jews lived in Egypt. That's a fact. Egypt has been Jews lived in Egypt from before Sancheiriv. Jews lived in Egypt.
Well, yeah.
Jews lived in Egypt. Now you see next one, text number 4, the Gemara says, on page 111, it's taught in a Brisa. Rabbi Yehuda said, one who did not see the great synagogue of Alexander in Egypt never saw the glory of the Jewish people. They said that at a large basilica with colonnades within colonnades, at a time there were 600,000 men, and another 600,000 men, and 1.2 million people in this synagogue. Twice the number went out of Egypt. And it was there that 71 golden chairs corresponding to the 71 members of the Great Sanhedrin, each in which consists of no less than 21,000 talents of gold. And there was a wooden platform in the center. A section of the synagogue would stand on it with scarves in his hand. And when it came time for the congregation to answer Amen, because you couldn't hear, right? The chazan was in front. This building was humongous. Hundreds of thousands, a million people in a building. How are you going to hear? So you used to have a flag system. When the chazan ended the blessing, they put a flag up and everybody answered Amen.
Wow.
Not they heard the chazan, they saw the flag up and everybody answered Amen.
I have a question. When the Jews left Egypt originally,
Yep.
4/5 were left behind, right?
Right.
Did they all die, or some
Yeah.
didn't die?
They all died.
They all died.
They all died. Ultimately, this whole situation, Alexander the Great chased the Jews out of Egypt.
Why is it called great?
It's a
That was his name, Alexander the Great. That was his name. He was Alexander. Alexander himself chased the Jews out of Egypt. Actually, we'll see in a second. Killed he waved a scarf, and all the people would answer Amen. So we're talking about millions of Jews lived in Egypt. This is talking about only men that came to Shul. We're talking about millions of Jews lived in Egypt. This is the times of the Mishnah. This is before Sanchev. So millions of Jews lived in Egypt.
There's a huge Geniza, Rabbi, in there.
Yeah, sure. And then even after that, that's the next in page 112. It says, the Gemara says, Abaye said, all of the people congregating in that synagogue were killed by Alexander the Great of Macedonia. He killed all the Jews.
He killed them?
He killed them. Why? It was due to the fact that they violated the prohibition. What were they doing in Egypt? Abaye says, it's a Gemara's time. You shall henceforth return no more to the ways of the Egyptian, and they return. What are you doing in Egypt? When Alexander arrived, he found them and saw that they were reading the verse of the Torah scroll. God will bring a nation against you from the far, and as a vulture swoop down, a nation whose tongue you shall not understand. He reasoned. I sought to come by ship in 10 days, and a wind carried me, and the ship arrived only in 5 days. Concluding that the verse applied to him, he set upon them and he slaughtered, he killed the Jewish people. So Alexander lived like 200 years after Sanchev. So Alexander lived 200 years after Sanchev, and there was millions of Jews living in Egypt. Millions of Jews living in Egypt. Why were millions of Jews living in Egypt? Where did they get this? Where did the Jewish people get this leeway to go and live in Egypt? Listen, until in 1948, ultimately the Jews were chased out of Egypt. There's a very small now left community in Egypt, but 1948 ultimately. Until 1948, there was always a big Jewish community in Cairo. There was a big community, Jewish community. Egyptian community.
Was from Egypt, Rabbi.
What?
Rabbi Evan.
Yeah, there's a lot of great people from Egypt. It's not the Arizal, I think, was from Egypt. The Arizal was from Egypt.
Oh, the
Yeah.
One time when we were watching in Israel, we met a man who said he was King Farouk's tailor.
What?
One time we were in Israel, and the guy said I was King Farouk's tailor.
Wow. Okay.
That's from Egypt.
Yeah, there's not a lot of people. So, look at text number 5, page 113, a statement of Rabbi Lezer Metz. This is from the 1100s. Talmud scholar, Lacha Cathari, Rabbi Lezer Metz of France. So he wrote, I've seen and heard of many great Jews who went to Egypt, and I was puzzled. How did he justify that? Perhaps he could explain that since the verse states, you shall not return that way, it's prohibited to return from the land of Israel to Egypt.
Yeah.
The Rambam didn't come from Israel. He came from Spain. But to move there from another land is permissible. Maybe but that's why the Jews in time of Sanchev, in time of Alexander, they came from Israel. They didn't come from any other part of the world. They came from the land of Eretz Yisrael. So that's why Alexander felt that those Jews didn't have the right to be in Egypt.
He was a Torah expert.
You see, he heard him saying a Torah verse, and he translated that it meant him. Support for this is a story from the biblical Daniel, who traveled from Babylon to Egypt, city of Alexander. So we see that Daniel also traveled to Israel. Let's look at another interpretation, 6a, page 114. The Radvatz who lived in the 1500s, said, we can explain that the Torah only forbade traveling there to settle permanently. As the Jerusalem Talmud states, you may not return to live there, but you may return to do business, or trade, or to conquer another land. Those who traveled there originally didn't travel for the sake of settling, but for business. Though they ended up settling there, at that point it only violated a minor statute and did not violate the court prohibition. So most Jews went there for business, and they stayed. Or they came from other countries. Nobody wanted to settle in Egypt. It was hard for them to settle any other country. It was hard to, trust me, in the time of the Rambam, it was a very difficult life in Israel. It was not an easy life to live in Israel. It was harsh living. For many years, until, Jews always lived in Israel. They didn't have that's why you're learning the Alter Rebbe, the chitas of the days. The Alter Rebbe is begging for charity for Israel. Why? So talking about the 1700s. Jews lived in Israel, they were extremely poverty. The Jews who lived in Israel were extreme poverty. So it was worse poverty than the Jews in Russia that were poverty. But the poverty in Israel was worse than the poverty in Russia. Because it was very harsh times. Extremely harsh times. And it was like that for many years. It was not like that it was like for hundreds of years. That was extremely not easy for Jews to live in Israel. Besides all the nations that took over Israel, they didn't let the Jews, live there in peace. Besides that, to make a living, to survive, most of the people couldn't survive, but on outside help. So therefore, a lot of Jews couldn't live in Israel. Like the Rambam, Parsha couldn't live in Israel. They would starve. Parsha starve. So I mentioned Alter Rebbe, a group of Chassidim went to Israel, colleagues of the Alter Rebbe, and then they needed to have the Alter Rebbe to Parsha simply keep them alive. The Alter Rebbe was in Russia, who was, to begin with, begging from people that didn't have much money. Begging them, you don't have money, but we can't let the Jews in Israel, starve. We have to help them. Which got him in trouble, because they said he was supporting the Turks against the Russians. That's one of the things that they tried to bring him to trial against. So, therefore, here he says, we can explain that the Torah only forbade traveling there to settle permanently. Okay, right, those who traveled there originally didn't travel for the sake of settling, but for business. Though it ended up in settling there, at that point it's only violated a minor statute. They felt that the excessive burdens associated with relocating and the lack of sufficient available food in the surrounding area justified their remaining there. So that's one of the reasons the Jews not allowed to leave Israel even today. The only reason why one of the reasons he's allowed to leave Israel is to make a parnasa. If you can't make a living there, or to get married, find a shidduch, or to learn Torah. But you shouldn't leave Israel today either. So he continues. Rabbeinu Dov ben Zimri, he says, and for how our teacher Maimonides could have settled in Egypt, Maimonides himself, how did Maimonides, the leader of the Jewish nation, settle in Egypt? We can answer that he was forced by the government. He had no choice.
He was forced by the government what?
To remain there. He had no choice. That's it. If he was a physician, the king and the ministers, he had no choice. He was basically forced to be in Egypt. He had no choice. It was not to his will. I too lived in Egypt for quite a while, studying and teaching Torah, and I in fact established a yeshiva there. This is permissible, and I thereafter relocated to Jerusalem. So ultimately, for the sake of Torah, for the sake of learning, but ultimately I went back. But he had no choice. The Rambam had no choice. And therefore, text number 7. This rabbi says, Rabbi, Isra Hapachi. He lived in 1280. He said, when I was in Egypt, Rabbi Shmuel of blessed memory, a grandson of the Rambam of blessed memory, told me that when the Rambam would sign his name on a letter, he would sign, signed by the author who transgresses 3 prohibitions daily. As a partial consolation, I told him that perhaps the great rabbi of blessed memory was justified because he was forced to remain there as a physician to the king of Egypt. So he had no choice, but he felt still that he was lacking in the mitzvah of going back to Eretz Yisrael. I'm sorry. In the mitzvah, in the aveda of living in Egypt. In the aveda of living in Egypt, sin of living in Egypt.
But he's buried in.
Yeah, he's buried. No, he didn't go back. They put when he died. He said he told the community to put him on a chariot and wherever the chariot stops, that's where they should bury him.
So that's where he's buried.
So the chariot traveled for days and days until it stopped in Tiberia, and that's where they buried him. That's the story. That's the tradition of the story. So the question is now. His son is buried here also. The question is now. The question was asked. This is an interesting question that was asked of Rav Avadia, Yisrael of blessed memory, about going to visit Egypt in this present time. There was a story that there was by the agreement between Israel and Egypt. One of the writers, one of the reporters, asked him a question if he can go to Egypt.
Yes, sir.
Asked Avadia Yosef if he can go to Egypt. So he writes an answer in text number 8a in page 117. It's very questionable, in fact, inconceivable. The Rambam would transgress the prohibition of the Torah, God forbid. Even if we were to explain that the Rambam was forced to remain in Egypt as a physician, a king, and his minister, it's still implausible that he would have written of himself that he had transgressed the Torah prohibition. Indeed, a number of latter rabbinical authorities refused to believe the story of the Rambam. See, for example, in Shivili Dat, where the author writes how much pain the kafter of a ferach, another interpretation, testimony caused. Additionally, we have many excellent letters from the Rambam with no such signature found on them at all. Sephardic Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem, Rabbi David Chazan, also wrote in the Yeshav Lev that the claim that the Rambam signed his letter with one who transgressed people daily should not be believed, for it's certainly false. Wow. So Rabbi Avadia Yosef didn't feel that was true. He felt that the Rambam would not write such a thing. Would not write in himself that he does an aveda. If Rambam felt he was doing an aveda, he would go against. He would put his life in danger and get out of there, because he wouldn't write, "I'm doing 3 avedas every day." So it's interesting the way he said, but he ultimately ends off and he says, mutter, it's permissible for Israeli journalists to travel to Egypt to cover the peace negotiations with our neighbors. That was his final conclusion. That he gave them. He said because it's business, and it's not a problem to go for business to Egypt.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
question. If the Rambam wrote that 3 times a day he sins because he doesn't get in Israel, what's wrong in it? What's wrong in saying the way that he feels? Why do they say no? He wouldn't.
Because if the Rambam was a righteous man, he wouldn't say I'm doing a sin. And if he felt that he was doing a sin, he would have gotten out of there. He would have given up. He would put himself life in danger and sneak out of the country. If the Rambam felt he was doing a sin, he would sneak out of the country and get out of the country, not do a sin. It doesn't make sense for the Rambam. He didn't live there 1 year, 2 years. He lived there many years, and it doesn't make sense I agree with him, but I don't know. I'm not a professional, but I agree with that. For the Rambam to write that the rabbi does 3 sins every day, and he continues to do 3 sins every day. Get out of this, get out of the sin. Figure out a way. Sneak yourself out of the country. Figure out a way. Why would you do 3 sins every day? It really doesn't make sense for the Rambam to write such a thing. But Rav Jesus says that. He says it doesn't make sense for the Rambam to write such a thing. So we have to really see such a letter. That's an essence. We have to really see such a letter. So somebody said they saw such a letter. Where's the letter? Let's see such a letter.
Never found the letter?
No. It's a tradition, whatever. There's such a tradition that somebody said that they never saw such a letter. They have other letters. So Rav is right. So let me see such a letter. It doesn't make sense such a letter. So you're saying a story that there was such a letter. Let's see the letter.
But apparently he wrote out a lot of letters like that.
But it seems like there was no. He wrote a letter. He wrote. Where are the letters?
Okay.
So let's see the letter. Let's see such a letter. It doesn't make sense.
Maybe he felt he was the only medical.
It doesn't make sense. It's really it's very highly, very high. The Rambam would write, I'm doing 3 sins, and he continues to do the 3 sins. If he felt it was a sin, what he's doing, he would have got out of there. Doesn't make sense.
I think it's not.
It doesn't make sense. No, it's not because of nobility. It doesn't make sense. If the Rambam felt it was a sin, he would have got out of there. Simple as that. That's it. Rambam felt it was a sin, he got out of it. Rambam, you must say that Rambam felt that it was not a sin. Unless you want to say that Rambam said, I wrote a sin to him, it was a sin. But to say he did a sin doesn't make sense. No, Yidden were meisen nefesh not to wear yarmulke. And the Rambam is meisen nefesh. The Jews that were meisen nefesh gave it the life not to break a rabbinical mitzvah. But the Rambam did a Torah prohibition, and he just accepted it. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Jews gave up their lives for smaller things than a Torah prohibition. This is a Torah prohibition, not a rabbinical prohibition. So, as I said, Jews gave up their life for smaller infractions than a Torah prohibition. Here, the Rambam is right, I'm doing Torah prohibition. It doesn't make sense.
But you're saying 1 million people gave up that Torah prohibition.
That's why Abaye says they were put to death.
1 million.
Because they shouldn't have gone to, they shouldn't have left, they shouldn't have gone to Mitzrayim. They would take a wrong. But later on, so the question is, did they go to business? Abaye felt they had no right to go. 1.2 million people, millions of people to go and live. All of them are going for business. 1 million Jews are living on business in Egypt. Again, talking about Egypt. We're not talking about come to America. We're talking about Egypt. That's where the Torah says don't go live in America. The Torah says don't live in Egypt. So the Torah is talking about a specific country.
But you just said don't live in Egypt if you're from Israel.
Oh, so that's a little. But the Jews of that time of the story of Alexander, they were from Israel, because in that time all Jews lived in Israel. They were not living anyplace else but Israel. So they all came. All these Jews came from Israel and they moved to Egypt. Now, most Jews maybe they don't come from Israel. They're coming from other parts of the world. Well, I don't know how many Jews live in Egypt.
But it seems to me
But to go to Egypt to go to Egypt for business, in essence, you can go to Egypt for business. Should you go to Egypt for vacation? Maybe not. Maybe not. Not because it's not a good, nice place. But the Torah says don't go to Egypt. That's it. It's it. Okay, that's an inference. But in general, it says don't go to Egypt. You're right. So you can find that that's the loophole that says don't to live there. But really, you don't have to give that push, because the Torah says don't go to Egypt. So don't go to Egypt. That's it. Why are you going back to Egypt? Why go to Egypt? You want to go see some? You want to see pyramids? Take a picture. Let somebody send you a picture. Whatever. Whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a good thing to go to Egypt.
Has that ever been a bone of contention at the current negotiations, whatever?
No. Chabad went to Egypt one year to do a Siyum Rambam in Maimonides synagogue. So there was a delegation. It was a big thing. The delegation went to Cairo. There's a synagogue, Maimonides synagogue, still there, and they made a completion of the Rambam in his synagogue with the permission.
Is there a Chabad in Egypt now?
No, there's no Chabad in Egypt.
And the Rebbe gave a bracha for the guy.
Yeah, that was a beautiful thing because they went to learn Torah. They went to honor the Rambam. So they went there and they went back. It was not. They didn't go to visit Egypt. They went to do a mitzvah. They went to finish the Rambam in his synagogue, and then they went back.
Maybe
It was not. I don't think they even slept over there that night. They were there and they went back.
Rabbi, maybe there are no Jews living there anymore.
There is Jews.
Okay.
Yeah, there are some Jews living in Egypt. Not a lot. But these are Jews that lived in Egypt before. They're living. Jews lived in Egypt for centuries.
There's 6,000 Jews in Alaska.
So let's just do one more thing. Let's do one more thing, and it's again a Jewish law. And let's go so the question is, let's go back to the situation. What's the difference between marrying a convert, an Egyptian convert, that you're allowed, the Rambam says openly you're allowed to do that. Because of Sancherev, right? He says you're allowed to do that. But going back to Egypt, that the Rambam is not happy with. Right? Irrelevant. The Rambam is not happy with going back to Egypt. So what's the difference between marrying, so why marrying a convert that converted is allowed and going back to Egypt is not allowed? What is the real difference between the two? And this is the end of the class. What's an important concept in this halachic part of the class, because there is a difference. If you were listening to the class, there's a difference between going to live in Egypt, whether you're allowed to go there because of business or to go live there, you're not allowed to go really, or to marry a convert that comes to Egypt today. Let's say you have a convert, an Egyptian that converts, you're 100% allowed to marry him according to halacha, even though he's from Egypt. Why? He's from Egypt. The Torah says openly, you're not allowed to marry an Egyptian.
You're not allowed what?
You're not allowed to marry an Egyptian.
Because you're going to go back.
No, but you're not allowed to marry an Egyptian. I thought they were going back. You're not allowed to marry an Egyptian. That's not because they're going back. You're not allowed to marry an Egyptian.
So conversion
It's not really an Egyptian.
Oh, so it's not really. Why? I mean, what is the meaning of that law?
Because they were mixed up, you said.
So then why you not live there because you're mixed up and then.
That's the land.
Ah.
The land is
So now we're going to explain this in a halachic concept. So listen to this. Listen to this halachic concept. You with me?
we have to pay attention.
You have to pay attention to this halachic concept. Ready? Yes. Text number 9. You ready? You got to listen to this halachic law.
This is Rabbi Cairo.
The following applies when there are 9 stores selling meat. If you walk in the street and you find a Zeitel Fleisch, you find a Zeitel. You know what a Zeitel Fleisch is? A Zeitel means a half side of the animal. It's called a Zeitel. It's a whole big piece of meat, right? You find this piece of meat in the middle of the street. Wow, this is a lot of.
You already lost me.
Yeah, right. We're not talking about you're going to eat it, dude. It's a question of halacha, right? There's 9 stores that are kosher. There's 1 store that's not kosher. 9 stores are kosher. 1 store is not kosher. Where did this piece of meat come from?
Probably the
But
coach.
you don't know.
Probably the kosher, right? Because we go to the majority.
Because
Because you go to the majority.
But you don't know.
You go to the majority. That's the law of going to the majority. Since there are 9 stores that are kosher, 1 store is not kosher. The start of this meat comes from the 9 stores that are kosher.
Really?
But the Jews wouldn't let a piece of meat get lost.
No, but the Rabbanan, the rabbis, would prohibit this piece of meat, irrelevant.
Yeah.
But Minatayra, according to the law, to the essence of the law, if there's 9 stores that are kosher, and one is not kosher, and this piece of meat is laying in the middle of the road, this piece of meat most probably came from a kosher store.
Okay.
And I can go and eat it. I'll tell you, the rabbis would prohibit it. Because it's basar and salam la'ayim, because it's meat that has lost contact of its trail. So the rabbis would prohibit it. I'm not talking about the rabbis. I'm talking about the law. So here, the following applies when there are 9 stores selling kosher meat, and one sells treif. Meat found in the market, such in a town, or in the possession of a Gentile, is permissible by biblical law. Because most stores are selling kosher. And you go to the majority. So if suddenly this meat is not by the store, and you don't know exactly where the meat came from, you can eat the meat. I'll tell you the Torah, the rabbis would prohibit it. I was going to tell you, you're not allowed to eat the meat. Because the rabbis would say, the meat has lost its connection. We're not sure exactly, and therefore the rabbis would say, you cannot eat the meat. But we're talking about the law. What happens if you bought a piece of meat? You went, bought a piece of meat. You came out, you go, you walk around and you say, wait a second, where did I buy this? I can't remember I bought the meat from. I can't remember. That's why today it's very important that you buy meat that has a package and has a label, etc. But those days, you went to the butcher, he cut up the meat for you, and that's it. He sent you on your way. You come out, you're not sure exactly where, let's say you're not sure exactly where you bought the meat. You forgot. There's 9 stores that are kosher. There's 1 store that's not kosher. What do you say the law is?
It's kosher.
No. Then it's not kosher. The law is the opposite. It's 50-50. Because you took the meat from the store. When you took the meat from the store, right? You took the meat and you're not sure which store you took it from, now it's 50-50. Because, what?
Why would you not be sure when you bought the meat, if you bought the meat?
Because the meat is from the store. Now that you took the meat from that store, you're not sure which store you took it from, then it's 50-50. So there's a difference between you found meat or you purchased meat.
That's what I'm saying.
If you found meat, you found something that the meat moved away from its source, then you say, if there's a majority of kosher source, it probably came from a kosher place. But if I took something from someplace and I don't know where I took it from,
it's still 90%.
No, I don't know where I took it from. Then if there's one non-kosher store there, and I took the meat from someplace, and I don't know where I took it from, then it's 50-50. Doesn't make a difference how. If there was no non-kosher meat stores there, it's only kosher. If it's only kosher meat stores there, then I took it from a kosher meat store. But no, because if I take something from someplace, and I don't know where I take it from, then even if there's one non-kosher store there, it's possible, if I don't know where I took it from, it's possible maybe I took it from a non-kosher store.
But why would I go to a non-kosher store?
Whatever, I was dreamwalking.
You know,
I didn't realize it's a non-kosher store. I don't know. If I don't know where I take something from someplace, then it's not in the fault in the piece of meat. It's the fault in me. You understand? When the fault is in the piece of meat, it's not in me. The piece of meat is it doesn't know where it came from. But when the fault is in me, I don't know where I took it from. The piece of meat came from a specific place. I took it from a specific place. And I'm not sure where I took it from. Now, if there's a non-kosher establishment right next there, now it's 50-50. And now the meat is not kosher.
Rabbi, it really makes
Yep.
sense. It makes sense what you're saying, but it's pretty disgusting to
Yeah, you're a vegetarian, it doesn't
take a
matter.
piece
Say
of,
it like it is.
to take a piece of meat that you don't even know where it's coming
You
from.
forgot, you
Who's
forgot.
gonna do that?
The fact
It's
that
very simple. No, you're not listening. You're not listening. You guys are not listening to. You have to listen to the analogy. You have to listen to the connection.
Yeah, I know.
When I buy a piece of meat
Yeah.
from a store, then there's the connection between the store and the meat. There's no question in the meat. There's a question in me.
Right. That makes sense.
It's a big difference between there's a question in the meat or the question in me. This meat came from a specific place because I bought it in a specific place. The question is, I don't know where I bought my stuff. Now, if there's a non-kosher place there and you're in doubt, it's 50-50. If there's a question not in me, but there's a question in the meat, then the meat, we go to the majority. Since the majority of kosher stores, it comes from, most probably from a kosher store. I'm not telling you, according to the law, that's what the rabbis prohibited, because there's still a non-kosher store there. But according to the law, it's considered a kosher meat. It's probably considered a kosher piece of meat. It is considered, probably is considered a kosher piece of meat.
why can't they just kosher it and then?
You can kosher, non-kosher piece of meat.
But we don't know.
Okay, so yeah, but don't get off the subject. You got to understand the difference. It's very important to come to why we're coming to this. So if there is a doubt in the meat, you go to the majority. If there's no doubt in the meat, because the meat came from a specific place, and because I bought it from a specific place, the doubt isn't within me. And remember what I'm trying to tell you, because this is the ethical teaching, this is the moral, this is the Chassidic part of the class. If the doubt is within me, we got a problem in Jewish law. If the doubt is within the meat, you go to the majority. That means I don't know what I'm buying. Right? I go to a place, there's 9 kosher stores, there's one non-kosher store, and I have a doubt which store I bought it in. It's not a question to me, the question is in me. What, I don't know where I don't know where I'm buying my stuff from. I go to a store and I don't know if it's kosher or not kosher. I'm in doubt later. Maybe it's a non-kosher store. The meat's not in doubt where it came from. It's Zalman book is in doubt where it came from. Then you got a problem. As long as there's a non-kosher meat store, then now we have 50, I might be 50%. We're going to turn it to 50-50. The lesson over here is important.
So
The lesson's important. That's why we can never get out of our situation, because we're always in doubt. Not in doubt in the subject, we're in doubt in ourselves.
always.
And that's where it becomes 50-50. That's the problem. It's not the problem that there's in Egypt. The problem that we can never leave or go to Egypt. We are in doubt. And when we are in doubt, that's where there's going to be an issue. That's where everything is 50-50. So as long as the Egypt stays the Egypt, and you're not in doubt, you don't have a problem with the concept of Egypt, because you let it go. The Egypt is the Egypt. But if you yourself are in doubt, that's when everything comes 50-50. Yes. Let's just look at the words. Maybe if you look at the words, text number 10. Let's look at the words, okay? So the following applies when there's 9 stores selling kosher and 1 store selling non-kosher meat. If one purchases meat from one of the stores and it is unknown which store he purchased from, he can't remember which store he bought it from, it is forbidden. For when something is fixed in its place, we assume that 50-50 chances chance of it is permissibility. So now, that's the problem.
I know that the word Amalek means doubt, but I remember that Mitzrayim means something else, not just Egypt. Doesn't it mean something?
Signs and contractions. Confinement. So now go back to Egypt. Going back to Egypt. Going back to Egypt, the question now, so this guy who converts, this guy that converts, an Egyptian that converts, what do you say? Maybe he's not Egyptian?
No, I get it.
We still,
So he's Egyptian, but you were not permitted to him because there's a question in you.
No. Good one. Good one. Good one. Good one. Good one. Very good. No. The analogy is different. The analogy is going to be, since there were always Egyptians there, even Sancherib, that chased away majority of the Egyptians, still there was Egyptians in Egypt. He didn't chase away all the Egyptians. So there's still Egyptians there. So still Egypt stays Egypt today. It's not saying, okay, let's not call it Egypt anymore, we'll call it Japan. It's not, it's Egypt. Because even though Sancherib chased away most of the Egyptians, there was always Egyptians in Egypt. And therefore Egypt stays Egypt. You can't say Egypt's not like the lost piece of meat that we don't know where it came from. No, because Egypt is like 50-50. Because even though majority of Egyptians left, there's still Egypt. They still didn't chase away all the Egyptians. Egypt stays Egypt.
Right.
But the person who converts left Egypt.
So that's good.
The person who converts is like the meat that walked away. The person that converts is like the meat that walked away. He left Egypt. He left Egypt. He left the store. And therefore, it's not a problem. And therefore, it's not a problem. Because he is 50-50. He's like the meat that left the store. So he's like the meat who left the store. And since he's like the meat who left the store. So then you go to that majority. The second he's like the meat who left the store, we go to the majority.
Oh, he's like the meat that left the store.
So we go to the majority. And the majority, so if he was an Egyptian, it's Egypt. Therefore you're not allowed to go back to Egypt. Because Egypt is Egypt. But if you have a convert that left, became a Jew, that convert is like the meat that left the store. If you have a meat that left the store, then that meat is permissible. Because it left the store, and you go to the majority. The second the meat leaves the store, you can go to the majority.
Oh my God.
I don't know which one it is.
What?
I still don't know which one it is.
What's that?
The Egyptian
So Egypt is Egypt, because that's like meat that was bought from the store. Because Egypt stays Egypt. Even though there's other stores there too. There's other nations there too. Because Egypt stays Egypt. As long as Egypt stays Egypt, you're not allowed to go there. The total prohibition going there. To live. Right. Even though there's many nations there. Because Egypt never changed. There's a not like the non-kosher store, you're not allowed to go and buy. You have to make sure to buy from the kosher store. Because Egypt stays Egypt. But now the convert is like the piece of meat who left Egypt. It's like the piece of meat that was found in the middle of the road.
Why don't they just say that?
No, the piece of meat that left the road, you go to the majority. Since there's nine stores that are kosher, and there's only one store that's not kosher, the meat that was found in the middle of the road, you go to the majority.
And therefore he's kosher.
Therefore he's kosher. Therefore this convert is kosher. Because he left the store. He left Egypt.
He left Egypt, forget about the store.
No, the analogy is from the store. The analogy is a difference between... No. Okay. The analogy is different. The analogy is the law. It's a connection to the law. The analogy is the connection. If you understand the law, you understand the analogy. If you don't understand the law, you can't understand the analogy. So the analogy is from the law. The law is when you find the piece of meat out of the store, you go to the majority. When the piece of meat is bought in the store, it's 50-50. So Egypt is 50-50. Even though there's a lot of nations, other nations in Egypt, a mixed up situation like most countries, but Egypt stays Egypt. In the story, Egypt stays Egypt. The Jew that convert, the guy, the convert, the Egyptian that converts, he's like the analogy of the meat that was found out of the store. And therefore, since he's now out of the store and you found this piece of meat,
He's kosher.
he is kosher because you have majority and not the Egyptians. That's the analogy. Let's end this off. So Amir Chayafi says, although Sancherib uprooted the nations and placed them in other seed, a minority of the Egyptians certainly remained in their place. Thus, the Egyptian in Egypt would be considered his original place. And therefore, the majority principle cannot be applied because they're in Egypt. But nevertheless, like 11b, page 120, nevertheless, this individual who now converted is considered as he has left his place. And the rule is that when something is no longer in its place, it's assumed to be part of the majority. Therefore, they are permitted immediately to marry a Jew because they left their place. And since they left, they didn't leave Egypt, maybe they're still living in Egypt, but they converted. And by them converting, they left Egypt.
That's good enough.
And therefore, now they become now how you allowed to marry? The Torah said they're allowed to marry Egyptian, because when they converted, they are not part of the part of, they go to the majority. In Egypt, majority are really not Egyptians. They're all different nations. They're a melting pot like any other country.
Amen.
So now we come to the Rebbe, the last two texts, and we'll finish this class. On this basis, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch ruled that today an Egyptian convert may marry a Jew because by the very act of their conversion, they have left their place. In contrast to other Egyptians who remain in Egypt, though they are a minority, they're still considered Egyptians. Right? The Rambam agrees that even though they're a minority, maybe a minority of Egyptians are real Egyptians, because the Sancherib moved them all around. So they might not be religious. Might be Edomites. They might be who knows who they are, but they're still Egyptians because there was always Egyptians there. Sancherib didn't get rid of all the Egyptians, and as long as there is Egyptians there, they're Egyptians.
Don't they have to be a majority?
No, that's the point of it. You don't have to be enjoyed. That non-kosher, that's the whole concept of the piece of meat. If I buy the piece of meat from the store, even though there's one store against 9, it's 50-50. So it doesn't go to the majority. It's going back to everything is going back to that law of the store and the piece of meat. You got to remember that law.
Yeah, but the law is from the majority.
No, it's actually a minority. Actually, the law is a minority. You have 9 kosher and 1 non-kosher, so it's a minority.
Oh, you're talking about that part, saying, but the kosher is the majority.
And still in all, it's not kosher. And still in all, this piece of meat is not kosher. Even though the majority is kosher. Because why? Because you took the piece of meat from the store. And now it's not a majority against a minority. It's 50-50. So too, in Egypt, as long as the Egyptians there was always Egyptians in Egypt, Egypt is considered Egypt. Even though they're a minority. Even though Sancherib made Egyptians a minority in Egypt itself. Because it never left. Egypt never left Egypt, so to say. Therefore, because of that, the prohibition against that's why there's a prohibition setting it, because that minority that stayed in Egypt makes Egypt Egypt. You're not allowed to go live in Egypt. So that we should not learn from the behavior remains in effect. One whose Torah observes lack. Okay, so therefore, now let's come to the spiritual lesson of this class. That's what we all came for.
That's right.
I thought it was the meat.
Got it.
Wasn't it the meat, the spiritual?
One who's a Torah observer lacks passion, hasn't fully left Egypt. That's the problem. We have never fully left Egypt. In so much as he takes no pleasure in the spirituality. That's Egypt.
Yeah.
But does everything only because he must. Or he's a little afraid of his wife. He automatically is being chased by Pharaoh. I didn't mean his wife is Pharaoh, so take that back. And his army who wishes to enslave him again. In other words, the confines of the Yetzer Hara and the animal soul still have a hold on him, limiting expression of the divine soul. The only way you can get rid of it is if you leave it. If Egypt is a mainstay in your life, then it'll always be 50-50. It doesn't make a difference if you have a majority of good. You have a majority of kosher. If the non-kosher is a fact, and that's doesn't move, never changes, you'll always be 50-50. You need to let go of the Egypt. You need to let go of the past.
So it's about
You gotta move on. You gotta move on. You gotta leave it. So even once you leave, even though the non-kosher is still there, you didn't get rid of your Yetzer Hara. You didn't get rid of your evil totally. But when you let go, when it's not a mainstay, you let go. Even if it's there, you go to majority. Majority, you're good. So you always go to the majority. You go to majority if you take it away from the situation. You go 50-50 if you always leave the situation as equal, as important. And it doesn't make difference. If you leave the evil, the Mitzrayim, my confinement, my constraints, as an equal to the kosher, then you're always going to be 50-50.
Yeah, I'm gonna be in trouble.
Because the question is, am I taking it from the kosher? Did I take it from the kosher side? Did I take it from the non-kosher side? What did I take it from? Which side did I take it from? Did I take it from the holy side? Did I take it from the unholy side? I don't know where I took it from. And therefore, I will ultimately have 50-50. I have to be able to let go. I have to realize, to be able to let go. The past, the Mitzrayim, I have to let go. And when I can let go, even though it's still there, I took it out of the shops, so to say. I took it out of. Now, it goes according to the majority. And every person in the majority is good.
Wow.
So the Torah tells you, stop going back to Egypt. Stop going back to your confinements in life. Stop going back to your hang-ups, your challenge. Stop going back to these things. Because if you're making it a metzias, you're making it as a mainstay, you're always going to have 50-50. It's always going to be an important thing in your life. You'll never, ever get rid of it. You need to let it go. And again, I say, even though you let it go, it's still there. You need to let it go. And even if it's still there, it's not important. It's there, but it's not as important as the positive that you have in your life. So even if you have negative in your life, you have certain things that are negative in your life, you're not going to per se change it. Let it go. Don't make it so important. And then you'll always you'll always fall on the majority of good. You'll always fall back on the majority of good. And that's the beautiful thing.
Rabbi, this is an amazing lesson for these 40 days.